Nearly 16 million Americans, or almost 5% of the total population of the United States, identify themselves as Italian Americans, putting them just behind the Germans, the Irish, and the English in terms of European immigrants to America. The first Italian to have technically reached what is now the United States was Columbus by way of the territory of Puerto Rico. The first to reach mainland North America was Giovanni Caboto, often referred to as John Cabot. Caboto was an Italian who completed the first English crossing of the Atlantic, which became the starting basis for English claim to what became the United States, but he likely landed in Canada rather than America. But the first Italian immigrant, that is, born in what is now Italy, who decided to come and actually live in what is now the United States, was probably Pietro Cesare Alberti. Alberti was born on an island near Venice in 1608. Between 1629 and 1631, massive outbreaks of the bubonic plague had ravaged the areas. Reports were that as many as 46,000 of the 140,000 people living in the area around Venice, or about a third of the total population, had died of the plague. But unlike most people in that area, Alberti had left the Catholic Church to become a Protestant. So when he decided to flee Venice, he decided his best option was to settle in a Dutch settlement in the New World, then known as New Amsterdam. He arrived in 1635, and by 1642 he had married a Dutchwoman by the name of Judith Mange. The two had 7 children together, living on a 100-acre farm in what is now Brooklyn, until he and his wife were killed in 1655 during a conflict with Native Americans. His 6 surviving children became wards of the Dutch state, receiving lands in what is now Long Island, where many of their relatives remain to this day. While there were a number of other instances of Italian immigration during the colonial era, there was nothing that we would describe as mass migration, as what was Italy was largely Catholic and what is now America was largely Protestant. Filippo Mazzei, for example, was born in Tuscany, and after traveling the Middle East for a few years, ended up in London working as an importer. There he met Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and was convinced by them to come to the colonies. He and Jefferson became friends, with Jefferson giving him some land for plant experimentation. In 1774, Mazzei wrote a pamphlet which included the phrase Jefferson translated as, quote, "All men are by nature equally free and independent. Such equality is necessary in order to create a free government. All men must be equal to each other in natural law." While both men were likely citing the works of John Locke, some have argued this was the basis for Jefferson's "all men are created equal." Also, it should be said Mazzei was not so much as an immigrant as a visitor, as he returned to Italy shortly after the Revolution. Notable musicians also came to America to set up conservatories and teach generally. Thomas Jefferson specifically recruited a group of Sicilian musicians to come to America, and that group became the core of what is now the Marine Corps Band. The first opera house in New York can be attributed to the work of an Italian immigrant who became the first professor of Italian at Columbia University. After the Louisiana Purchase, there were more areas in the United States where Catholics might be able to practice their faith, but it still wasn't a major destination for Italian immigrants. Prior to the Civil War, Italians in most of America were an uncommon sight, with estimates of around only 25,000 immigrants in total moving to the country between 1820 and 1870. But things started to change dramatically in Italy around 1861. But before we get to what changed, let's talk about what came before. The area we now think of as Italy was unified under the Roman Empire for over 700 years, prior to the fall of Rome in the early 4th century. But for much of its history, there was no singular Italian state. For over a millennia after the fall of Rome, a period that was longer than the existence of the Roman Empire, Italy was largely divided by factions, often with different impacts on different regions. When the north of Italy was conquered by Germanic groups, Catholic church leaders appealed to a Frankish ruler in what is now France by the name of Charlemagne for aid to protect Rome. This alliance led to the establishment of the Papal States, and for Charlemagne to be crowned as the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. However, following Charlemagne's death, the empire was divided and alliances weakened. The south of Italy at times found itself invaded by Islamic forces. In fact, the island of Sicily was conquered for about 50 years from 1852 to 1902 by a caliphate. Lacking any kind of strong central government aside from the Papal States, large portions of Italy found itself ruled by feudal kingdoms and city-states. Some of these city-states were exceptionally wealthy. Venice and Genoa were powerful enough to exert control over a number of trade colonies throughout the Mediterranean and Black Sea, creating near monopolies over trade between Europe and Asia, in the Middle East and Africa. This wealth allowed city-states to hire mercenaries to ward off threats, which combined with the geography helped keep them safe from outside invaders. While they weren't able to conquer, economically and defensively they were just as powerful as much larger empires that surrounded them, and arguably even more influential. But the various leaders of the Holy Roman Empire never relinquished their claims or connections to the Catholic Church over the years that followed, even if they lacked the military strength to enforce those claims. In fact, central Italy and the Papal States were so weakened that for 70 years between 1309 and 1376, 7 consecutive popes were more or less forced to live in Avignon, France, rather than the Vatican and Rome. Starting around 1348, the Black Death came to Europe, starting in what is now Italy thanks to its connection to international trade. Estimates were that about a third of the population died in what is now Italy, leading the disease to spread throughout Europe, where it produced similar devastation. When the crisis passed and it came time to rebuild, Florence, Italy was uniquely situated to take advantage. Their currency, the florin, was the most widely available and trusted currency exchange throughout Western Europe. The massive number of deaths meant higher costs for labor with less income from taxation. This put the bankers of Florence in a position of incredible power and influence to the many wealthy families and countries that found themselves in need of loans. Florentine banks throughout Europe made the families of the city incredibly rich. Other Italian city-states with international trade connections similarly benefited, particularly Venice and Genoa, whose connections to the slave trade in the Middle East and Eastern Europe were even more profitable in the times of labor shortage. All of this wealth, connected to trade and finance in urban-centered city-states, created a system of wealthy patrons who funded elaborate artistic, religious, and research efforts, which we now look back on as the Italian Renaissance. The most famous of these is probably the Medici family of Florence. They famously financed much of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and were a major funder of artists, scholars, and writers including Botticelli, Michelangelo, Raphael, Da Vinci, Galileo, and Machiavelli. When the papacy returned to Rome to start to rebuild the city that had fallen in disrepair, the funding came largely from these wealthy bankers and traders in the Italian city-states, which gave them incredible influence with the church. It was also during this time that the Sistine Chapel was commissioned. The collection of ancient scientific texts from all around the Mediterranean, Middle East, and Asia by wealthy Italian nobles was combined with the invention of the printing press in 1440, making those areas centers of research and learning. But with the fall of Constantinople in 1453, many Italian merchants were cut off from the Black Sea, and with it most trade with Asia. As there was no real central Italian state, merchants and traders in this area were more than willing to join with any nation that would allow them to find new routes to Asia to engage their trade. Italian explorers like Columbus and Caboto didn't care which country gave them the boats, they just wanted to control the trade. When the wealth was pouring in, the city-states were able to purchase mercenaries to defend themselves and overcome the shortage of actual population. But now that Italian trade was hindered by the expanding Ottoman Empire blocking trade, the amount of wealth coming in began to decline. At the same time, the New World trade along with new sea routes around the Horn of Africa began to grow, decreasing the importance of Italian trade routes. As a result, the balance of power changed. Various city-states had always had ongoing conflicts with each other, but it generally remained between the city-states. But in 1494, leaders in Milan convinced Charles VIII of France to invade, with France going so far as to capture Naples. This invasion showed that the old ways were now insufficient, and the surviving city-states and kingdoms began looking for alliances. These alliances often came through marriages, where a family could create a large but more or less physically unconnected empires, with monarchs being able to make claims to various parts of countries and cities, with no real cultural connection other than through the marriage. Probably the most well-known and arguably the most powerful was the Habsburg dynasty. Through a series of marriages, a single person was able to claim Holy Roman Emperor, the Spanish throne, much of Germany, and claims throughout Italy. To illustrate the complexity, let me tell you the story of Charles of Ghent, who was born in Belgium in 1500. When Charles was born, his claim was heir to Burgundy and Duke of Luxembourg. But his mother was the daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, the King and Queen of Spain, who married to unite the largest kingdoms there. They were famous for funding both Christopher Columbus and the Spanish Inquisition. Charles's father ruled over Belgium, parts of the Netherlands, and the Burgundy region of France, as well as being the heir to the Holy Roman Empire, which at the time was primarily controlled what is now Germany. They had also recently just acquired parts of Austria and Hungary. Just a few months after Charles was born, Charles's uncle, the only male child of Ferdinand and Isabella, died at the age of 2. This made Charles's mother the heir to most of the Iberian Peninsula and all of its New World holdings. At that time, Charles was left behind by his parents when he was only a year old so that they could go to Spain to assure his mother's claim. In 1504, his grandmother, Queen Isabella, died, making his mother Queen of Castile. After negotiations, his father was named King of Castile in 1506, but his father died shortly after at the age of 28. His mother, by most accounts reportedly already mentally unstable, was said to have a full nervous breakdown at that time, and was, for all intents and purposes, informally institutionalized for the rest of her life in a Spanish palace. As a result, Charles, at the age of 6, inherited his father's holdings and had a strong claim to become the heir to the Holy Roman Empire through his grandfather. King Ferdinand remarried following the death of Isabella, and had a son in 1509 who would have been the heir, but he died just a few hours after his birth. Although Ferdinand had a number of illegitimate children, including males, the only legitimate male heir was Charles. Therefore, when King Ferdinand died, because his mother was deemed mentally unfit, Charles became the King of Spain at the age of 16, despite never having lived in Spain and not being fluent in Spanish. At the age of 17, he was crowned Charles I of Spain. In 1519, his paternal grandfather passed away. Thanks to the wealth of the Spanish crown, he had the political clout and financial ability to pay the needed bribes to secure the position as Holy Roman Emperor at the age of 20. He was then crowned Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire by the Pope himself. At the age of 20, Charles was now the ruler of two of the most powerful empires in Europe, neither of which he had grown up in. He also had claims to large parts of Italy, including the Kingdom of Naples, Sicily, and Sardinia, where he also had no connection. And he also had a claim to French-occupied Milan. But titles do not mean acceptance. Rebellions rose in Spain throughout the 1520s against perceived foreign rule. King Francis of France, who had also made a claim to become the Holy Roman Emperor, declared war on Charles in 1521. But this war proved disastrous for France, forcing them to concede Burgundy as well as being driven out of Milan. Despite a former pope crowning Charles, the new Pope Clement VII was concerned by Charles's power and worried that over time he might supersede the papacy. He sought to form an alliance with Charles's rivals in France, along with several powerful Italian city-states. Charles raised an army, mostly of mercenaries, and they were able to defeat the French and Papal alliance in 1526. But the mercenaries reportedly were not receiving the expected payments from the Holy Roman Empire, and so they decided to find other ways to enrich themselves. The mercenaries proceeded to march south and sack Rome, which was at the time lightly defended. The mercenaries pillaged Rome for 3 days. The Pope himself was forced to surrender. The sack of Rome also apparently led to an uprising in Florence, which temporarily removed the Medici family from power. Italy continued to be embroiled in wars from foreign invaders working with various city-states for decades until 1559, when a treaty between France and Spain, as well as a separate treaty between France and England, established some level of stability. During this time of turbulence, the Catholic Church shifted from seeking funds to build monuments to seeking out heretics and heretical beliefs. Just prior to a French invasion of Florence, a Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola made prophetic statements about the fall of the rich and the powerful of the city. As the French approached, he said in his sermon, quote, "I announce this good news to the city, that Florence will be more glorious, richer, and more powerful than she has ever been. First, glorious in the sight of God as well as men. And you, O Florence, will be the reformation of all Italy. And from here the renewal will begin and spread everywhere, because this is the navel of Italy. Your councils will reform by the light and grace that God will give you. Second, O Florence, will have innumerable riches, and God will multiply all things for you. Third, you will spread your empire, and thus you will have power temporal and spiritual." In 1497, Savonarola held a bonfire of the vanities, where his followers were encouraged to burn heretical objects that might compel them to sin. But later on, when he refused to join the Pope's alliance with the French, he was excommunicated and executed in the same public square where he held the bonfires. Still, his rise to power seemed to mark a shift for the Catholic Church generally in Italy, toward restraining teachings that ran contrary to church doctrine. This was likely in response to the growing Protestant Reformation movement throughout the rest of Europe. By 1542, Rome called for an Inquisition to be formed to root out the heresies, primarily focused on Protestantism, but also famously at science that might run contrary to Catholic teaching, such as Copernicus's heliocentric universe. Between 1545 and 1563, the Catholic Church held the Council of Trent in what is now northern Italy to formulate plans for the Counter-Reformation movement to reassert Catholic dominance. Italian Protestants tended to flee to other parts of Europe rather than being to establish footholds with the Church being so powerful in the area, meaning Catholicism held firm in all of the Italian kingdoms and city-states. But economically, Italy began to decline in importance as Mediterranean trade began to pale in comparison to what was coming from the sea routes to Asia and the New World, which didn't have to contend with the Ottoman Empire. And as large portions of what is now Italy found themselves under foreign rule, international problems having nothing to do with them geographically still affected them economically. For example, the failure of the Spanish Armada was also deeply felt in its Italian holdings. And it wasn't just in terms of politics. A massive outbreak of the bubonic plague, which started in northern France around 1623, spread across Europe during the 30 Years' War. When the outbreak reached Italy between 1629 and 1631, it devastated many of its port cities, with cities losing between 10 and 60% of their total population over those 2 years. Southern Italy in particular became very poor and disconnected from the rest of Europe during this time. Who the foreign ruler might change from time to time, but practically little else changed other than where the taxes were sent. None of these foreign rulers particularly prioritized Italian interests. And while the Catholic Church attempted to reassert Catholic dominance by war and heresy, the rise of Protestantism functionally decreased its influence and power, and with it the power of Rome and Italy generally. In 1796, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded the Italian peninsula, eventually reaching and capturing Rome in 1798. Napoleon had been born on the Italian island of Corsica, and some have argued he was as much Italian as he was French. An English painter named Joseph Farrington in 1802 said that someone who met Napoleon said, quote, "He seemed to be disappointed in the look of countenance and said it was that of a little Italian." It was during Napoleon's invasion that the Italian tricolor flag was created, and most historians seem to agree that it was during this time that a growing unified national identity began to form in Italy among Italian speakers. While the peninsula was still occupied by a foreign power, as it had been for centuries at that point, The French revolutionary ideals encouraged a level of local self-determination that had not existed prior under the Austrian, Spanish, or French monarchy rules. Also, some resistance movements against the French rule later became the Italian nationalist movements, most notably the Carbonari, or charcoal burners. The Carbonari were a secret society with cells all over Italy, likely an offshoot of the Freemasons. When Napoleon was defeated in 1814, control of Italy reverted back to the system of rule that existed prior, but the seeds of revolution had been planted. Southern Italy, including Naples and Sicily, became the Kingdom of Two Sicilies. Northern Italy was more subdivided, but still generally under Austrian authority. In 1820, the Carbonari incited a number of riots against the Austrian and Spanish occupation. In Naples, they were able to gain promises of reform, which were likely untrue, but even the promises created hope that led to a popular march on the city of Turin, and actual reforms were implemented as a result. However, the Catholic Church under Pope Pius VII condemned the Carbonari, ordering them excommunicated and leading to the arrest of many of its members. By 1830, all across Europe, revolutionary sentiment was growing, following French revolutionary forces forcing the King of France to abdicate his throne. In Italy, these uprisings grew to the point that the Austrian army was forced to march across the peninsula, putting down protests and the popular uprisings at the behest of the Pope, with some of the Carbonari leaders being arrested and executed, and others being forced to flee the country, including to America. But those who fled to America specifically at this point were still small in number, given the anti-Catholic sentiment there. In 1844, two brothers from Venice attempted to free a group of political prisoners and start a large-scale popular uprising. The attempt failed and they were captured and executed, but reporting that they shouted, "Viva Italia," or "Long live Italy" as their last words, before the firing squad made them martyrs. By 1848, Italian resistance movements were actively organizing boycotts of taxed goods, with revolts occurring in Sicily and Naples. The Sicilian revolt led to a brief period of independence before control of the island was taken by force the following year. Relatively nonviolent protests in Tuscany in 1848 brought about some reforms, including a local constitution, and to the surprise of many, Pope Pius IX granted the Papal States a constitution as well. In response to this, an Italian soldier who had been living and training in South America by the name of Giuseppe Garibaldi wrote to the Pope, quote, "If these hands, used to fighting, would be acceptable to His Holiness, we most thankfully dedicate them to the service of him who deserves so well of the Church and of the fatherland. Joyful indeed shall we and our companions in whose name we speak be, if we may be allowed to shed our blood in defense of Pope Pius's work of redemption." Taking inspiration from Sicily, popular uprisings in Milan and Venice were initially able to force Austrian soldiers to flee to the local garrison. This gave revolutionaries control of the cities and even convinced the local king of Sardinia to back the uprising, selecting the previously named Garibaldi to lead his army. Even more popular uprisings appeared across Italy, including in the Papal States of Rome, and as a result, several monarchs and even the Pope himself were forced to flee. But before he left, the Pope gave a speech disavowing the revolutionaries, which was a crushing blow to the uprising. As the King of Sardinia wrote, quote, "The Pope's speech is an act which could have immense consequences. Certainly it will do damage to the cause of Italian independence." Austrian forces, now with the backing of the Pope, were quickly able to put down the rebellion. Garibaldi fled to New York for a time before returning to South America, but he had become a folk hero, particularly in southern Italy. In early 1859, Italian nationalist forces in Sardinia were able to convince the French to support them in exchange for Nice and Savoy, under the condition the Austrians attacked first. Later that year, the Sardinians were able to provoke the Austrians into war, leading the French to come to their aid and send 170,000 soldiers, which was more than double the size of the Sardinia army. While the war was a success, Garibaldi was upset at relinquishing Nice, his hometown, and was not ready to stop fighting, but he was persuaded to turn his attention south rather than toward Nice. Southern Italy had been ruled by a branch of the Bourbon royal lineage, which was connected to both France and Spain, under what was called the Kingdom of Two Sicilies. Garibaldi gathered a group of volunteers to go assist with an uprising on the island of Sicily. On May 14, 1640, he declared that he was assuming a dictatorship over Sicily. His supporters were called the Red Shirts. They started with less than 1,000 men, but Garibaldi was able to recruit as he went, having over 25,000 when he arrived in Sicily. As a result, he was able to take control of Palermo and the island generally. He then brought his forces over to the mainland and proceeded to force the king there to abdicate his throne and agree for the kingdom to be annexed under the single kingdom of Italy in 1861. Austria still held on to part of northern Italy, but finding itself at war with the neighboring Prussia in 1866, it was unable to hold, further expanding the kingdom of Italy to include Venice. But there was still one major piece left: Rome. The French supported the Papal States for several years, which prevented the final conquest, but in 1870 they were forced to recall their troops back to France as Prussia marched on Paris. The King of Italy wrote to the Pope, offering him to allow the army to come peacefully. Reportedly, Pope Pius threw the letter onto the table, exclaiming, "Fine loyalty! You are all a set of vipers with whited sepulchres and wanting faith." He then said, "I am no prophet nor a son of a prophet, but I tell you, you will never enter Rome." The Italian army marched slowly on Rome, hoping a compromise would be made. But it was not. Cannons breached the Vatican walls, and after the death of 53 Italian soldiers and 19 Vatican defenders, Rome was also under Italian control. The Pope declared himself a prisoner, but was free to come and go as he wished. In 1871, the capital was moved from Florence to Rome. These wars for Italian independence created the first substantial wave of Italian migrants to come to America, often as unskilled labor for the transcontinental railroad projects. But even this increase was still not near the numbers seen by other immigrant groups that had come to America. But that would all soon change. While the unification of Italy was generally very popular among Italians, it also created huge structural changes in Italy for everyone who lived there. Northern Italy tended to be more trade-focused and was in the process of industrializing, while southern Italy remained largely agrarian. As the unification also began in the north, much of the planning and the design of the government was focused on northern interests, and much of the decision-making around how the government would operate were in place prior to the south joining the rest of Italy. As a result, when the new government came to power needing resources, northern leadership did not seem to realize how much the rulers of southern Italy had neglected creating or maintaining even the most basic infrastructures there, such as sewage and roads. Starting around 1812, the writing was on the wall, and many of the feudal lords in the south began to rent or sell their land to private citizens and to spend less time and money administrating the territory. As the feudal system began to decline, with it also went the existing legal and judicial system in the area. Under feudalism, the local ruler was also the local court and law enforcement. With those rulers gone and the new government either weak or absent, local people were left to settle disputes on their own. When the nobles left entirely, they also took their personal wealth with them, leaving only the land they had sold, often to wealthy landlords. These landlords often rented to poor tenant farmers, gaining most of the benefits in terms of wealth with few of the responsibilities that came with governance. And each new generation of tenant farmers found themselves with less and less land and no real opportunity to save or acquire land that would change their conditions. The new Italian government was in need of funding, and so they increased or created new taxes on goods from the south. These taxes were often more than could reasonably be paid by the poor families working the land. However, because voting was done by census rather than directly, for all intents and purposes, the voting was done by the landowners who actually completed the ballots rather than by the people actually working on the land, meaning they had almost no power to make changes. And even prior to unification, southern Italy specifically had long had issues with highway robbery and brigandage. It was almost socially acceptable to rob rich travelers given so many foreign nobles occupied the land. But when these nobles were forced to abdicate, taking their personal armies with them, the lack of effective law enforcement meant the brigandage not only continued but greatly expanded. An Italian economist named Francisco Severo Nitti would later write in 1899, quote, "In every part of Europe there have been bandits and delinquents who, in times of war and misfortune, have dominated the country and set themselves apart from the law. But there has been only one country in Europe where brigandage has existed, it can be said, from time immemorial, a country where brigandage for many centuries has been like a river of blood, and hate a country for which centuries the monarchy has been based on brigandage, which has become like a historical agent. This country is the south of Italy." Sicily specifically struggled with organized brigands gangs. With the nobles either absent or ineffective, if you had a grievance or an issue, you were unlikely to be able to find local lords to send out as personal retinue to help you to work it out. And with this absence of any official legal path to resolve disputes, other solutions emerged. The true history of the Italian Mafia is hard to pin down, as the accounts are mixed with as much mythology as fact. What seems clear is in western Sicily specifically, local men were recruited by wealthy landowners to help resolve disputes and provide protection against bandits. These young men were often themselves former bandits and brigands, meaning often the payments they received were as much as a bribe not to rob as it was payment for actual services rendered. Citrus farmers and cattle raiders in particular were in need of these services because of the vulnerability of their goods and the need for near constant protection from theft and sabotage. The leader of the Palermo National Guard in 1864 described these organizations as, quote, "a sect of thieves," writing that they made, quote, "affiliates every day of the brightest young people coming from the rural class, of the guardians of the fields in the Palermo countryside, and of the large number of smugglers, a sect which gives and receives protection to and from certain men who make a living on traffic and internal commerce. It is a sect with little or no fear of public bodies, because its members believe that they can easily elude this." When the northern government did send forces down to the south to attempt to address the brigand issue, they often did so with great violence. In 1863, the Italian government passed a series of laws known as the Pica Laws, which allowed not only the government to send the military to seek out and arrest brigands in the area, but also the relatives of brigands and anyone suspected of collaborating with them. All of these factors led to poverty and unrest throughout southern Italy, and as a result, many sought to leave. Between 1860 and 1914, between 9 and 14 million Italians, mostly from southern Italy, left to settle in the New World. Of these, an estimated 4 million specifically chose America. These were mostly young men, many of whom did not intend to stay in America, only coming to take advantage of opportunities, send some money home, and return after a few years. They were enticed by what came to be known as the Padrone system, where they were recruited by middlemen to come to work for a period of time at a set rate with housing and transportation to the work site provided. America was in the process of massive industrial expansion, building factories and railroads, and labor was in short supply after the Civil War. All across the United States, in most major cities, these workers would find housing in areas referred to as Little Italies. There, the middlemen would meet their basic needs, often in dilapidated, overcrowded tenement apartments, in exchange for labor on a given project. And then they would move them to other areas of the country as work appeared and was required. The workers would then send back remittances through middlemen to their family, again with the intent of eventually returning to Italy. In 1896, the New York Times wrote describing Little Italy as, quote, "They are laborers, toilers in all grades of manual work. They are artisans, they are junkmen. And here too dwell the rag pickers. There is a monster colony of Italians who might be termed the commercial or shopkeeping community of the Latins. Here are all sorts of stores, pensions, groceries, fruit emporiums, tailors, shoemakers, wine merchants, importers, musical instrument makers. There are notaries, lawyers, doctors, apothecaries, undertakers. There are more bankers among the Italians than among any other foreigners except for the Germans in the city." But these new immigrants did not find a warm welcome, particularly from groups that found themselves in competition with them. A large number of Italian immigrants found themselves in the city of New Orleans, settling in a section of the French Quarter that came to be known as Little Sicily. The mayor of New Orleans was a man by the name of Joseph A. Shakespeare. He complained the city was attracting, quote, "the worst classes of Europe, Southern Italians and Sicilians, the most vile, vicious, and worthless people among us." He said that these Italians were, quote, "filthy in their persons and homes," and that they were, quote, "without courage, honor, truth, pride, religion, or any quality that goes to make a good citizen." On October 15, 1890, New Orleans Police Chief David Hennessy was shot and killed walking home after work. It was reported that as he lay dying, he whispered the word "Dagos," a derogatory term for Italians, to police officers who found him. This was then reported in the local newspaper. The mayor reportedly told the police to, quote, "scour the whole neighborhood and arrest every Italian you come across." Within 24 hours, at least 45 people were arrested, with accounts as high as 250 being rounded up by the police. Eventually, 19 men were charged with the crime and held without bail. A few days after Hennessy died, the mayor gave a speech where he said Hennessy was, quote, "the victim of Sicilian vengeance," and he called for the people of New Orleans to, quote, "teach these people a lesson they will not forget." He appointed a committee to investigate, quote, "the existence of secret society or bands of oath-bound assassins," and directed them to, quote, "devise necessary means and the most effectual and speedy measures for the uprooting and total annihilation." The committee published an open letter to the Italian community in New Orleans, which ended with the following paragraph: "We hope this appeal will be met by you in the same spirit in which we issue it, and that this community will not be driven to harsh and stringent methods outside of the law, which may involve the innocent and guilty alike. Upon you and your willingness to give information depends which of these courses shall be pursued." At the trial that followed, a jury found the evidence was insufficient to convict anyone for murder. In fact, 4 of the men were acquitted entirely, with 3 others returned to the judge for mistrial. But all 19 men remained detained, often on charges that would have to be dismissed as a result of the acquittals. A group calling themselves the Committee on Safety put an ad in the local paper that read, quote, "Rise, people of New Orleans. Alien hands of oath-bound assassins have set the blot of a martyr's blood upon your vaunted civilization. Your laws in the very temple of justice have been bought off, and suborners have caused to be turned loose upon your streets the midnight murderers of David C. Hennessy, in whose premature grave the very majesty of our American law lies buried with his mangled corpse. The corpse of him who in life was the representative, the conservator of your peace and dignity." A crowd, reportedly in the thousands, gathered near the prison where the Italians were being held. A lawyer gave a speech where he told the crowd, quote, "set aside the verdict of that infamous jury, every one of whom was a perjurer and a scoundrel." The mob then marched on the prison, shouting, "We want the Dagos." As the crowd was beating down the doors of the prison, the warden freed the men and told them to hide as best they could. 11 of the men were found and killed by the mob. 9 of them were shot or clubbed to death inside the prison. 2 others, including a mentally ill man, were taken from the prison and hung from lampposts. Reportedly, these bodies hung for hours long after the mob had dispersed. Rather than engender sympathy for the Italians, the lynching became a rallying cry for nativists. Massachusetts Republican Senator Henry Cabot Lodge wrote, quote, "These were the paupers and criminals of Europe coming to America." Teddy Roosevelt, 10 years before he became president, wrote to his sister about the incident, saying, quote, "Monday we dined with the Camerons. Various Dago diplomats were present, all much wrought about the lynching of the Italians in New Orleans. Personally, I think it was a rather good thing, and I said so." The leader of the lynch mob was a man by the name of John Parker. He would go on to be elected governor of Louisiana in 1920. In 1910, he said of the Italians that they were, quote, just a little worse than the Negro, being if anything filthier in their habits, lawless and treacherous. But like many immigrant groups before them, over time the sheer number of Italian immigrants changed the calculus, particularly in urban areas in the north. In most major cities of the time, there were political machines run by party bosses, who would use power and influence to aid those who voted for them. When Kansas City politician James Pendergrass was asked if he was a boss, he responded by saying, quote, I've been called a boss. All there is to it is having friends doing things for people, and then later on, they'll do things for you. You can't coerce people into doing things for you. You can't make them vote for you. I never coerced anybody in my life. Whenever you see a man bulldozing anybody, he don't last long. Probably the most famous political machine was Tammany Hall. While it was founded in 1786, it truly came to its own starting around 1848 by helping a huge wave of Irish immigrants coming to the city in exchange for their vote. By 1854, more than a third of New York votes were Irish. When party bosses began giving political positions and jobs to these Irish, many nativist groups engaged in riots and gang fights. These riots led to general discontent, eventually to the arrest of party leaders such as William Boss Tweed in 1872. But the foundations continued even after the leaders were replaced. Initially, Irish and Italian immigrants were in regular conflict with each other, as Italians, being newer immigrants, were often willing to work for lower wages and less likely to join labor unions. The Brooklyn Eagle newspaper ran an editorial with the headline asking, quote, can't they be separated? With the author asking contractors to, quote, keep their gangs of workmen distinct, the Irish in one street and the Italians in another, to avoid the constant fighting between the two groups. But over time, the condition of both immigrant groups began to change. As journalist Jacob Riis wrote in 1890, quote, the Italian scavenger of our time is fast graduating to exclusive control of the corner fruit stands, while his black-eyed boy monopolizes the boot-blacking industry in which a few years ago he was an intruder. And, quote, the Irish hod carrier in the second generation has become a bricklayer, if not the alderman in his ward. So many Irish had come that they were no longer considered outsiders. After a fight broke out between Irish and Italian work crews building the trolley system in Brooklyn, the paper wrote, quote, after several men had been knocked down, the Irishmen were reinforced by some of their compatriots in police uniforms, and the fight was stopped by the arrest of 20 Italians. The article then went on to point out, quote, the Italians will be arraigned before an Irish police justice and will receive punishment befitting their crimes. But over time, like the Irish before them, the sheer number of Italian voters made them a political power that had to be considered. An anti-Catholic sentiment meant that the two groups, while still rivals, also had common enemies. Italians began to get access to similar city jobs as the Irish, particularly in law enforcement, often specifically recruited to help deal with Italian organized crime. Joseph Petrosino was the first Italian speaker hired by the New York Police Department in 1883, and he became friends with Teddy Roosevelt, who was at the time a member of the New York City Police Commissioners. Petrosino became somewhat famous following his involvement in the investigation of an Italian extortion ring known as the Black Hand. This included the blackmail of opera star Enrico Caruso. He was also noted for investigating what came to be known as barrel murders in 1903. He eventually rose to lieutenant in charge of a special unit focused on crimes in the Italian community. Following the passage of a federal law that allowed for the deportation of an immigrant who had lived in the country for less than 3 years but had been convicted of a crime in another country, Petrosino traveled to Italy, likely to gather records on a number of known Italian criminals to facilitate their deportation. While in Italy, he was assassinated. When his body returned, the funeral was held at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, where reportedly 200,000 people took part in the procession. In 1916, Fiorello LaGuardia was elected to Congress from New York. He eventually became mayor in 1933, ending a long run of Irish dominance. But World War I greatly reduced immigration generally, and following it, in 1921 and 1924, immigration laws were passed specifically targeting reducing immigration from non-European countries as well as Southern and Eastern Europe. From 1901 to 1914, about 2.9 million Italians immigrated to the United States, or about 210,000 a year. But because the 1924 law used the 1890 census numbers for its calculation, it capped the number of Italians allowed to immigrate at 4,000 a year. But either this immigration quota was not enforced or poorly enforced, as the Italians remained about 6 to 7% of all immigrants to the United States until the quota was removed entirely in 1965. During World War II, most Italian Americans declined to support Mussolini and the fascist regime in Italy. But laws passed during World War I defined enemy aliens as persons 14 years of age or older who are within the United States and not naturalized. This applied to around 600,000 Italians living in the United States. In 1939, Franklin Roosevelt authorized J. Edgar Hoover to create a list of people to be detained in the event of an outbreak of war. Hoover had experience in this role, having been the head of the Enemy Alien Registration Section that conducted arrests and internments of Germans during World War I when he was just 23 years old. Even before war was officially declared on December 11, 1941, Hoover and his men used his authority to arrest around 147 men, nearly all Italians. By June of 1942, 1,521 were arrested, with 250 being held in internment camps for up to 2 years across the United States. In January of 1942, anyone who fell into the category of enemy alien was required to register, be photographed, and fingerprinted. They also had to carry an enemy alien registration card on their person at all times, and they were not permitted to have a firearm or hand camera, shortwave radio, or radio transmitter. 1.1 million people living in the United States were required to register. 92,000 were Japanese, 315,000 were German, and 695,000 were Italian. On Columbus Day, 1942, under pressure from the huge and influential Italian community, these restrictions were lifted, but only for Italian aliens. At the same time, a plan was announced to offer citizenship to around 200,000 elderly Italians who had been unable to meet literacy requirements, giving them the right to vote. However, there still remained hundreds of Italians who were interned. They were not released until about a year later, when Italy surrendered in September of 1943. At that point, they had been detained for nearly 2 years. History is awkward.